All right. Well, thank you all for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. So we have here Susan Zacharia. She is going to be talking about addressing the mental health needs of the church. So Susan is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs since 2013. She's currently working in suicide prevention and serves as a secretary for the mental health ministry in the Indian Orthodox Church. And we're going to ask that you hold all your questions till the end, until Susan is all done presenting, and then we'll go ahead and save time for questions.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm a little short, and I struggle with technology, so I fear that this may blink in and out. So if it does, let me know. Like Naveen introduced me, my name is Susan Zacharia. My hope today is to explore this topic, which is a very big topic, but hopefully I could provide a bit of, don't know why it's doing that. We'll see what happens. I'm hoping to provide the audience with a little bit of what has been tried in the Indian Orthodox Church, with hopes that it may be helpful for other parish settings. There's a lot of trial and error that's a part of this, but hopefully we can get some dialogue by the end of this discussion as well. So the objective today is to take a look at the model that's been used within the Indian Orthodox Church almost as a case study, or almost as an example of what could potentially be done. I'll speak a little bit about the nuances that are specific to an immigrant population, an immigrant faith-based population, and also what we did within the diocese to tackle some of these issues. So the Indian Orthodox Church is also referred to, you may have heard, as the Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church. It is one of the Oriental Orthodox Christian churches, and it is in the United States, it's a largely immigrant-based community. We probably have been here since the 1980s or so. Is probably when folks started immigrating from India, and since then, folks have gone across the country. So you'll see groups of Indian Orthodox parishes in large urban areas like New York, New Jersey, and then in what we consider as the Southwest Diocese is technically everything that's not what you would typically consider the Northeast region of the United States. So anything that is west of what you would consider the Northeast is what we call the Southwest Diocese. So that includes regions like Chicago, Florida, Dallas, Houston area, Los Angeles, San Francisco. We have parishes also in Vancouver, Seattle, all across the map. We have about 60 to 70, I believe, parishes at this point. All of them kind of vary in sizes within the Southwest Diocese. Some of them are as large as hundreds of family members, so about 200, 300, sometimes as small as 10 to 15 parish or family members in a parish. In the Chicagoland area, we have 4 Indian Orthodox parishes. One, I belong to the St. Thomas Orthodox Church, and actually in the back, Father Abraham Chaco. He is the parish vicar of St. Mary's Orthodox Church in Oak Lawn, Illinois. We have 2 other ones. One is in Elmhurst, and the other one is located in Bellwood. So I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of context as to where we're operating out of. It is largely an immigrant-based community, and as most immigrant-based faith communities, folks come to the country with the hope to not only preserve their faith, but in some way preserve their culture as well. And with that can come addressing certain issues, such as mental health, that's highly stigmatized within a certain culture, when the church may not view those issues in the same way that the culture may view it. And so it creates a disparity, it creates a discrepancy, and that's what we hope to tease out. What is the faith and what is driven by our culture? So I just wanted to give a little bit of keeps doing that, doesn't it? I'm just not noticing. It's okay, there's not much up there. I'll just keep saying my name over and over again as it blinks in and out. So I know I was already introduced. I think I kind of said a little bit about who I was in terms of what parish I go to. I wanted to give a little bit of a background as to my professional background. So I graduated from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, 3 hours south of here, in 2012 with a bachelor's degree in psychology, communication, and a minor in sociology. And then following, I received my master's at the University of Chicago in social work. Since then, I've worked in mostly the Department of Veteran Affairs. I've worked at the VA hospital here at Hines, right outside of Chicago. I've also worked at the VA in Seattle, and I've also worked at the VA down in Baton Rouge. Don't ask how I ended up there, and then I'm back here in Chicago. But I've worked at the VA settings in those different areas. And in most of my time at the VA, I've worked with veterans struggling to make changes to their substance use, alcohol and other drugs. I did a lot of individual therapy and group therapy, and within the last year and a half, I transitioned over to suicide prevention. So my job at the hospital right now with a team of 4 other suicide prevention coordinators is to meet with veterans that have struggled with thoughts of suicide but also have recently attempted to take their life. So I do a lot of work in the inpatient unit of the hospital, but I also do a lot of work providing consultation to providers that may have a patient sitting in front of them and doesn't really know what the next step is. So we provide a lot of consultation in that area. I also serve as a secretary of the Department of Veteran Affairs. That'd be nice, right? I serve as a secretary of the Department of Counseling Services within our ministry, within the Southwest Diocese. And so that is kind of where I would like to start a little bit. So this is a ministry, I believe the Southwest Diocese was formed in the mid-2000s, is that right, Achin? 2009. And so since then, we've always, in the diocese, we've always had a ministry titled Pastoral Care and Counseling. So the objective of that ministry was to provide the people with pastoral care and guidance in those areas. It never really took a form of any sorts, and so when I had expressed interest to our bishop at the time, he had asked if I could take on this role. And so since then, we took a look at what we've been doing, what we need to do, and we restructured it, including we renamed it to the Department of Counseling Services. It is it's meant to be a vague term. We're still trying to figure out exactly what needs to be done, and once we figure out what needs to be done, a whole new thing will need to be done. So it's a very dynamic process. In 2015 was when I took on this role. One of the biggest things we wanted to understand is what is it that the people need. As a mental health provider, I can take a look into, I can assume what our population needs. I can assume what would be beneficial, but it was very important for us to get the buy-in of not only the parish members, but also the parish leaders as well, clergy and ministry leaders. And so that's sort of where we started taking a look. So some of the information that we can base our work off of is the statistics and data that's already out there. So thankfully, we don't need to do a lot of investigation. I don't need to be the one that tries to figure out what does mental health prevalence look like in India. But it was important for us to understand because the stigma, when folks moved from India here, that stigma came with for mental health. And so what we do know in terms of mental health concerns within the world is that there are certain areas that show higher or lower depression rates on the globe, right? And so if you take a look at this is from the World Health Organization, you'll see different countries or different regions in the world highlighted with different colors. So you'll see places with higher rates of depression in red, and places of very low rates in gray. And if you take a look at India, it has a very, very low, supposedly low rate of depression. But if you take a look at the commentary that's written on the bottom, it says, the results may show an unrealistic low percentage in places such as Asia, where taboo around mental health causes people not to seek help. So unfortunately, there's a lot of, at least we know what we don't know. That's what we can say, we can find out from here. But that also means that there's a lot that we don't know. This is also from the World Health Organization, and this table or graph depicts the suicide mortality rate per 100,000. And if you take a look here, the darker the shade of teal, the higher the rate of suicide. And so what do you all notice about India in this map once the thing comes back on? It's very dark, right? It kind of contradicts what the previous map has shown. So death by suicide is a little bit more measurable than rates of depression, because rates of depression imply that folks need to be diagnosed, right? Death by suicide, we could do autopsy, and even then, a lot of times, family members won't want to find out any more information about a death by suicide if suicide is suspected. So these are based on the numbers that only based on the numbers that are reported, right? And so based on the information that's out there, knowing that rates of suicide in India are extremely high, and at the same time, there's a huge taboo and stigma around it, it gives us, as the ministry, enough reason to say, hey, there needs to be more work. We need to find out more information. And actually, the Indian Orthodox Church, you'll see, the tradition states that St. Thomas brought the gospel to Kerala, which is a state down in southern India. And one of the highest rates of suicide within India is South India as well. And so when we talk about this within our parish members and parish context, people are able to relate. Many people know somebody that have in some way been affected by a death of suicide. Now we can take a look at the statistics in India, but the reality is we're here. Right, so we are not in India. Immigrants here raise their families here in the country, in the United States, and based on other immigrant populations, we can safely assume that there will be a generation that's founded here and continued here. So we also need to take a look at the other side, which is what does the mental health prevalence look like in the United States? And so these statistics are from the National Alliance of Mental Illness, NAMI. And the basic, for those of you that are mental health providers or providers, you've probably heard these statistics before, that approximately 1 in 5 adults in the United States experience a mental health or mental illness in a given year. Approximately 1 in 25 adults in the United States experience a serious mental illness in a given year that interferes or limits a major life activity. And then you'll see down there, suicide is the third leading cause of death for people aged 10 to 24 in the United States, and suicide is the second leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 24. So we can provide these statistics, this data, to our parish members. We can provide it to our lay leaders as well. But the question that's always going to be, and has been asked back, is, well, how, even though I'm Indian, even though I'm in the United States, what does that say about me, right? How does this truly impact this parish that I go to? Especially in a community where we don't address or acknowledge these issues. If we don't talk about it, does it really exist? Becomes the question. So stigma is the reality of stigma is not just seen in certain parts of the world, it's seen everywhere. It is manifested in the ways policy is written, it's manifested in the way medications are made available and prescribed, and the number of barriers there is to access to care. Anytime we see a barrier to access to care, it oftentimes is informed by stigma. And the paradox of stigma is that in order to get rid of the thing we don't want to talk about, is to talk about it, right? So, what the Department of Counseling Services decided to do as its very first step is to create a needs assessment. So we took time in the very beginning, back in 2015, to create a survey that we distributed to all 60, 70 parishes within the Southwest Diocese. Knowing how surveys work, we knew that we would not get an accurate number of responses back to represent the entire population, but we figured this was a place to start. We asked questions about the demographics, so what age group do you belong in? What gender do you fall into? Have you experienced any serious psychological stressors within your family or within your parishes? And if so, what do they look like? Have you met somebody within the parish communities that have struggled with issues such as, and we allowed a number of issues, and we just listed them out and allowed the responders to go ahead and check it off. So we included issues like alcohol use, drug use, pornography, sexual abuse, self-harm, eating disorders, dementia, Alzheimer's. We listed a number of items that we can assume is prevalent within our community, although we don't acknowledge. And so what we ended up finding is that about 350 people responded to the survey. The survey was a Google survey. It was a Google form. It was anonymous. So we primarily sent it out electronically, but we also had an option for folks that were maybe not as technologically savvy, clearly as I am, because this thing keeps blinking. We had the option of having a hard copy mailed in, but majority, actually all of the responders responded through the online Google form. And so what you see here is a QR code. I didn't want to take up most of our time, even though it is 10:50 now. I didn't want to take up most of our time going through the survey, but if you all do have your cell phones, I would encourage you to go ahead and click the photo app, your camera app, and just hover. You don't have to take the picture itself. Just hover your camera over the QR code, and then you'll see a banner up top that says, that gives you access to a link. And so that link is a PDF, basically, of the needs assessment report. It's a summary of the statistics that were captured. Is that working for folks? And I can keep this up at the very end as well if you want to kind of go back. It's pretty hefty. There's an introduction there. We talk a little bit about what we hope to do with the needs assessment results, but it breaks down into different graphs, in bar graphs and pie graphs as to the information that we obtained. One of the questions that we had asked in the needs assessment was, have you or your family experienced sociological or psychological struggles in the past? And we did define those terms that you'll find in the needs assessment report as to what they look like. And what do you all notice from this pie chart in response to that question? More yes than no, right? Yeah. Significant enough for us to assume that there are issues that are not being discussed in the past or in our parish settings. So the following question to this question was, if so, please enter in this free text what it is that you've identified. What would you all assume that people would respond with? So in response to this question, a follow-up question was asked, what is it that you all have struggled with? What do you expect people to have responded with? Depression? What else? Anxiety. Mm-hmm. Bullying. Yep. So these are the responses. So the larger the words you see, the more responses contained those words. So about 350 people responded to the survey. Majority of the people responded with depression. A lot of people responded with anxiety. And you'll see other words up there as well. What other words stand out to folks? Family, church, addiction, abuse. It's probably a word that a lot of people use that I didn't take out of there. So people were able to write in complete sentences, and so I took away a lot of those filler words like a, the, prepositions and such, but much made its way in there. I see words like abuse, struggle, alcohol, stress. Yeah. This is not all too surprising based on the statistics that we have globally, but also nationally as well, right? But what do you all think happens when people within your own diocese, within your own parishes, see this information about themselves? What sort of response would this elicit from our parishioners?
I think there are extreme response reactions.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is, no, this doesn't exist in our parish. We don't have these kind of
Yes.
things. We're in a loving community. And the other one is the opposite, that we have all of this and it's very diverse
Yes.
and widespread in the parish.
Yeah. There's almost two camps. One camp is this can possibly not be true. This doesn't exist. It happens to other people. It happens to other communities. It doesn't happen to us, right? And then there's this other camp of probably folks that have very real experiences that cannot be avoided, where folks say, this is real, these are the issues, and not only are these the issues, but there are many other issues that we have not even captured. And so information like this, when we can hone in on the population that we are trying to serve, really puts that information right in front of their faces. It becomes very difficult to avoid. And so what we did initially as a result of the needs assessment data, the first step was to create that report that you all hopefully have on your phone right now. And as a follow-up, since 2000, I believe that report was completed in 2016. So really for the following 2 years, 2.5 years after that, the ministry's objective was to go to these different regions. So Dallas, Houston, areas in Florida, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco, different areas within the country where we know that there is a large presence of our community, and to provide the results of this survey within the walls of the parishes. So the question then that could be asked is, these are people within our churches answering these questions. The survey was provided to this parish, right? And so initially when we had distributed this survey, we had emailed every single parish priest and had requested them to disseminate it to their parish members. And so the question then becomes, my response is, or the statement or the reality is, my response, how I responded is reflected in this data. Furthermore, how the person sitting next to me responded is also reflected in this data, right? It becomes more of a reality towards what truly exists next to us. It combats, whether we like it or not, all the effort that's placed into brushing these issues under the rug. So when we do go out to these areas, these workshops were often attended, 100 people, sometimes down to about 50 people or so, and discussions were being had within the parish wall, within the parish building, with using words that are oftentimes socially taught not to be used within the church, right? So we're talking about suicide. We're using the word suicide within the church walls, right? We're talking about sexual abuse. We're talking about bullying. We're talking about pornography. We're talking about all of that. We're addressing it, not just talking about it, but we're addressing it within the parish walls. Because if people don't talk about it within the church, where will they talk about it? Outside of the church, right? It also sends the message that the church doesn't know how to respond to these topics. And as folks that are attending this conference right here, we know that's not true, right? Yes?
Is this something that we can see in Sunday school or starting with the young kids as well?
So that's a good question. So this slide, what else? Really, no, that's a great segue. Really, I was thinking about what the next, we've done this needs assessment, we've done these workshops, and we've identified that our job is not to continue to go around giving these workshops. What good would it do? The objective of the workshops is to raise awareness. And what we are seeing since the workshops have been started are that people are asking during events like family conferences or youth retreats. People are asking if there could be an expertise on the topic of addressing mental health or bullying to come and provide a discussion or facilitate a discussion of sorts. Now the people are asking for it instead of us saying, hey, this needs to be done, right? So the buy-in, the ownership comes from the parish itself. So that's a cue for us to be able to take a step back. So awareness still needs to be had, but that ownership now is with the parish, right? So then the question becomes, well, what's the next step for this ministry? What is it that we need to do? So maybe we no longer need to do workshops with the same intensity that we've done it in the last 2 years. The areas that we're looking at now are, what are these different groups of people? What is it that they need and what can we provide? One of the biggest objectives, and I'm gonna leave this up here. These are the goals that we've identified as a result of the completion of the needs assessment. So I'm gonna go ahead and read through this, and then we'll talk a little bit about goals that we have for the future, keeping in mind that this ministry is still very new, and this new ministry is within an even newer immigrant population that's only been around for 20, 30, 40 years at most, right? So the mission statement that we came up with was to promote physical, emotional, spiritual well-being to individuals, families, and communities seeking Christ by providing support, education, professional resources, and prayer in the midst of sociological and psychological stressors. I think the big takeaway is that the goal of this ministry is not just mental well-being or physical well-being, but it is a healing of the self, right? And if we continue to avoid addressing mental wellness, we have to ask ourselves, by avoiding it, are we truly avoiding healing ourselves? And if our taking care of our mental wellness is a part of our salvific journey, then it is something that we need to address and eliminate barriers towards within our own communities. Long-term goals include providing clergy and lay members a directory of spiritually and culturally competent mental health providers within each area of the diocese. I see some heads nodding, which is a big need for many communities, if not all communities. Publish educational materials and online resources for most common mental health concerns on the website for public access. Also a need across all jurisdictions and all communities. Offer scholarships for individuals looking to obtain graduate level degrees and licenses to practice clinical mental health services. So encouraging folks within our communities to pursue a career choice that may be otherwise discouraged at a certain point or maybe not seen as common. Incorporate education into workshops at major regional and area level conferences for all ages to promote discussion and understanding of mental health concerns. And then hold regular premarital and family workshops for each area of the diocese to increase awareness of mental and spiritual problems among believers and promote family unity and cohesion. So these are very vague goals. There are many, many other goals that we have. But one of the biggest takeaways, in addition to the results of the survey that I've realized overseeing this, a lot of the tasks here, is the importance of providing support for our clergy. And I think ultimately, and there is no data to support this yet, but my goal for the next step is to create a needs assessment for the clergy of our diocese, because I'd be really curious to know what it is that what they're looking for. I believe there's not a single priest within any jurisdiction that has not received a phone call in the middle of the night to respond to a crisis of sorts, and also be expected within that phone call to be able to intervene appropriately or to fix the problem, right? And so what is it that we can do to provide our clergy as a support, because our clergy are often the gatekeepers as well. If they don't have the information to refer folks, or if they don't have the education or training to understand what level of care is most appropriate, then what can be done, right? What I found in the last couple of years as well, since this ministry has become a little bit more public and visible, are that clergy are more than willing to reach out and ask for support. In fact, they need it. They want it. They're looking for it. And so long term, I believe this ministry will most likely look in such a way to provide support for the clergy, first and foremost, who oversee their parishes. Right? So we provide support for the leader of each parish, and we disseminate that information downwards. So that's all I have right now. It is about 11:05, so about 25 minutes for questions. If you all have any comments or questions, there's a mic right there that we're going to ask for folks to come up and ask. What questions do you all have?
And the mic is still recording. It's not going to be loud. I'm wondering if you, as you begin to address the needs of your diocese with depression and anxiety and these sort of not as serious mental health issues,
Yes.
if you guys have thought of using this concept of like unprofessional help, where you train people in the community to provide some of those basic kind of services without them needing to have a professional degree of any kind.
Yeah, so almost like a peer support model or so.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a TED Talk. I can't remember the name of it,
Okay.
but a counselor trained basically village grandmothers in Africa to sit on a bench, and they knew that anyone who came and sat on the bench with them needed some
I
help.
see.
They would give them basic counseling services, even though they themselves didn't have degrees. He trained them to give kind of basic services.
Sure, yeah. And that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. So in the very beginning, a lot of the feedback that we had gotten from the needs assessment, and you'll see one of the questions in that report that you pulled up with the QR code is what can be done. A lot of the feedback that people had provided was create hotlines or create a physical space for people to come in and speak. We never ended up pursuing that because the resources are extremely limited. And so what we had to consider, at least in the front or in the very beginning, was how can we use what's already made available and encourage people to use those resources. I think ideally, if a region is set up or a community is set up where the need is there, those are options that can be had. We thought a lot about whether or not a text hotline sort or like an email option, like an anonymous email option, or setting up sort of office hours of some sorts would be helpful. But we didn't want to tread down that path because we couldn't guarantee that these issues that were going to be brought up were only going to be ones that were not within the context of crisis. And so that amplified the concerns a tad bit. And so what we encouraged really the use of were the National Suicide Hotline, as well as there's a lot of other online presence out there. Yeah.
Thank you. What you're doing is amazing. This is really great, and it's almost for me a dream to have something like this in the Coptic community. So my question is, how'd you break in? And did you face any resistance? And if you did, how did that look like? How did you overcome that, and just obstacles, and just kind of how'd you breathe life into this?
So, thank you. Really, the way I got into doing this work, I took it upon myself to email our bishop at the time with a master's thesis that I had written when I was in my grad program. And in that thesis was how to provide quality evidence-based clergy training to promote mental health or increase access to mental health care within Asian Christian communities. And so I had my professor at the time really help me tease out that paper, and in addition to writing the thesis, I was asked to present it and sort of simulate what it would look like to encourage a board of people, including clergy leadership, to adopt this idea. And so I kind of had practice in my grad school setting, along with the support of my professor. At least I had the time and the resources to consider, play it out in my head. And then it wasn't until years later that I decided just to attach the PDF. It was actually after I got my independent licensure. I waited until I was independently licensed, and then I emailed our bishop at the time and said, if you need any help in this area, this is something that I'd be willing to take on. I think oftentimes what we realize is that the need is much, and so if parish leaders, if clergy, if bishops see somebody volunteering, they're ecstatic. Oftentimes they have to ask people for help. And so simply by me just saying I'm willing to help, I was put into this role, and I was really given a lot of latitude as to how to execute it with the blessing of the bishop.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really liked what you said at the beginning about kind of teasing out the difference between where the church's stance is on things and what the church has to offer as resources versus kind of teasing out what the cultural view is. And I was wondering if you might address how to begin conversations or what kind of wording to use, especially with addressing an older generation, also keeping in mind kind of the hierarchical and like power dynamics within Indian culture of younger people not being allowed to talk to their elders or confront them about issues that might be going on.
Yeah. So when we started doing this presentation, when we started doing the workshops around the different areas, I thought the largest pushback that I would get would be from the older groups of people, parents, aunties and uncles. But really, they were the ones that showed up. Shockingly, we did a conference in Houston. About 170 people showed up in Houston, and Houston is a very large area for our community, and only about 20 folks that were born and raised here showed up. The rest of them were people that would be considered in the first generation or immigrant population. I think that was a very humbling experience for me, because that showed me that this is not so much as a older generation versus younger generation sort of issue, because the reality is suicide is intergenerational. People have been dying by suicide since the beginning of time, right? People have been struggling with thoughts of depression and anxiety since the beginning of time. That's why the church has a lot to say about it, because this has been an issue for a very long time. And so when we give the space for those folks, for people that may understand the world a little differently simply because of cultural context, I was shocked and blown away by the words that were coming out of their mouth. Because again, a lot of times, people from India, people that were born and raised not from here, struggled with somebody that they know that struggled with alcoholism or drug use or abuse of sorts. the conversation looks a little different. But there was a sense of relief, anecdotally at least I can say there's always a sense of relief. And folks are always coming up afterwards saying, I struggle with this with my grandparents. I struggle with this with my husband or my wife. I'm not exactly. One time in Houston, I think it was in Texas at some place, I had an older gentleman in his 70s or so just raise his hand in the parish setting, in an Indian Orthodox community, raise his hand and say, I had an alcohol problem my entire life. I haven't drank in the last 20 years. You don't really hear that in our churches. That means that something is happening. So that mic will record what is being said, but it won't amplify. So I could repeat the question for the audience, actually, if that would be helpful.
Actually, your response was helpful, but I just was wondering if you could describe more what the workshops were like.
Yeah.
So, what was the population? How many people were there? And what was maybe something impactful that happened? Just the atmosphere of it. Because
Sure.
It's amazing that those happened. So just
Yeah.
an image of what that was like.
Absolutely. So we started off doing, so the director of the Department of Counseling Services is a priest who's also a social worker whose home parish is in Tampa, Florida. And so as a test site or a pilot site, that was the first place where we did the workshop. It was a very small workshop because there aren't that many Malayalis down in Tampa, folks from Kerala down in Tampa. But we had about maybe 30 people in attendance, which is pretty decent for that community. And after that, we did a presentation in Chicago, in this area, which I believe had about 80 folks attend. And what we did. So after Chicago, we did one in Houston, Dallas, San Francisco, and then other family conferences and youth retreats. We would just make sure to make our resources available and present at those sites as well. So what it concretely, logistically looked like, we were tasked with the responsibility of reaching out to the parish priest in that area. So for example, in Dallas, I reached out to the Dallas priest and said, hey, we're working on raising awareness of mental health concerns within our community. Would you be willing to advocate for this in your area? More often than not, they'll say yes, or there'll be somebody that's willing to take this on. And we were able to get one or two people in that area, lay leaders that were willing to help out. And so they took care of the logistics in Dallas. So we're working remotely, really, and through phone calls and video conferences. Over the months, we would establish a date, and then we would start publicizing it at the parishes. And we would arrange for technical stuff like food, the schedule, what that would look like. And the diocese would provide us with the funding needed to travel out there. Folks were willing to house us for a couple of nights. And we created a one-day schedule, really, where we come in the morning. We start with matins, and we do an introduction, and we typically also try to find mental health providers within the community also present there. The point of that being, we wanted to show the community that there are people locally that folks can turn to as well. So when we went to Dallas, we had a psychologist who had her own. She was somebody from Kerala. She had, or her parents were from Kerala, but she had a private practice of her own. She was a psychologist, and we also had a psychiatrist as well present, in addition to myself. My job there was to present the results of the data and elicit that conversation and facilitate that conversation. But the psychiatrists and psychologists sort of chose a topic of their own with hopes of building a relationship with the community. At the end of each of those workshops, we handed out feedback forms as well, just asking what folks thought about it on a Likert scale, rate how useful you felt that this was. More often than not, actually, I would say 99.9% of the time, it was a very high satisfaction rate. We have about 10, 13 minutes. Other questions? Okay, so I will put the QR code back up there for folks that weren't able to capture that. If this works. I think I just shut it down. It'll come back, and I'll put it back up. Yes. Yes, please do.
Okay, so the question that I have is, as far as doing this assessment, were the participants, as far as like the actual youth, were there any, was there interest in the youth of the church, or did you not, are you, I'm not sure what area, in that particular area, where you would go as far as peer pressure?
I see, like topics that were addressed.
Well,
you mean?
the issue of peer pressure, I had a friend who was thinking about marriage and was strongly asked to reconsider their choice because of the dynamics of what they believe they should be doing, so I think overall, most people can decide what's good for them or what they feel is the right alternative. But the only reason I ask this is because in that particular instance, another person that knew them was concerned about retribution. Someone has new ideas. And I didn't know, I'm not trying to say we want to like spark violence. I'm not saying that's what we're doing here. But I didn't know if there were any indications of anyone who might have an issue with trying to make these kind of changes after looking at an assessment like this.
So, and help me understand, I might be misunderstanding this, but it sounds like your question is, has there been backlash of sorts as a result of the needs assessment, as a result of the facts?
Yeah. I mean, for the most part, it sounds like most people were very appreciative.
Sure.
Of that.
Yeah, I would say I think that's a fair point to ask, because the things that this is eliciting is the emotion that these responses elicit is discomfort, is extreme discomfort, because it's not happy-go-lucky truths about ourselves that's being revealed, right? That stuff we can talk about openly. I would think it elicited some, I don't know about retribution, but at least anecdotally I could say that I think people were angry. I think people are frustrated, and oftentimes people take that frustration out on a church setting, a parish. The church doesn't allow for this, or I can't trust the leaders of the parish. I think oftentimes that's an indication of not having their needs met, right? Yeah, I don't know. That doesn't sound like it was a satisfactory answer. Go ahead.
No. I think that obviously this type of assessment and exploration shows people that you care and that
right.
you want to help. So that's fine. But usually there's usually someone, and so I'm kind of looking forward at the possibility of if this was something that anyone wanted to try to use.
Sure.
what kind of signs you would be looking for.
So I will also say one more piece. In facilitating the discussion based on the results of the survey in a large setting, so in a group of people, maybe like 100 people out there, someone, you're right, will stand up and be like, well, how do we know the data is actually true, right? How do we know, could one person have responded to the survey 10 times, right? We'll kind of find little loopholes to not justify the responses, right? Oftentimes, I resist the impulse to react to that, and I just take a step back and say, what does the audience think? And oftentimes, the audience will stand up and say, these issues are real. I know that I've faced them. So it no longer becomes the person that's tasked with talking about this convincing this one individual that's in doubt, but it becomes the people around them. It becomes the person that they sit next to on Sundays saying it. I would toss it back to, I would say the biggest takeaway that I've had from doing this needs assessment is to trust the audience. Trust that people need this. If you trust that process, give it back to the community will ask for the help that they need. I don't need to convince them that they need help.
That's useful.
Yeah.
The redirection.
Yes. Yep, the redirection.
Thank you.
Would you mind using the mic? Yes.
Was your needs assessment primarily focused on the Indian Church, or could it be used across multiple?
That's a good question. So it wasn't specific to the Indian Orthodox Church. It honestly was a set of questions that were not vetted by any scholarly researchers, so it could be amended in many ways. I'm happy to give the questions out to folks that might find it useful. I know Ocamper has come up with a task force that is looking at creating a needs assessment of sorts, targeting either parishioners or maybe members of clergy, but surveying the audience and the people that we serve to see what the need actually looks like. But it's not unique to any one community.
Sure, and I guess I just had a comment of something that my church has implemented to sort of address some of these broader, possibly discover mental health issues is small groups. And basing those small groups on topics that are relevant, like technology in our Christian faith, and people meeting with maybe peers or families and having discussions in community, having that to come out in a more natural and organic way.
Yes.
And then if it goes beyond that, then referring them, because it seems to be a less intimidating environment.
Sure.
And that's sort of a new ministry my husband and I have tackled within our church as a way to sort of connect when people were not wanting to really reach out.
Yeah, reaching out to one person may lead folks to reaching out to somebody else as needed, right? I think I believe the power of community. If the topic of this weekend is really about isolation and violence, if we don't know that these struggles are occurring, and if the person sitting next to us doesn't know, and if our parish priest doesn't know, then how can the help come forward? I also believe in doing these workshops, they're very formal, right? We're setting up formal workshops. The intention of this ministry is not to create a formal workaround addressing this topic. It really is to spark a conversation and give that ownership back to that community and say, hey, you want to do something the next time you all have a one-day retreat. Own the fact that you want to have this topic on technology and social media. That doesn't need to come from a leader of sorts. That comes from us and say, hey, this is what I need.
My experience in giving some mental health workshops within immigrant population churches has been that a lot of times you'll do the formal workshop, but then everyone has feels like the general doesn't necessarily apply or address their needs, and they want to ask they have very specific
Yes.
ways of wanting to seek out whoever is presenting that. How do you address that, and how do you prevent burnout from the individuals who are giving those workshops then?
Yes, yeah. So you'll see like an influx of people asking for your number, your email address, asking, hey, could I talk about this? Could you talk to a family member? I think that's setting up boundaries right off the bat. It's terrifying because you open up this conversation and you open up the reality of many unmet needs. I think what I've come to realize is that one person or two people or a group of people, even a committee, cannot solve those issues, right? But this is where hopefully over the years, in the next few years or so, we can create a more sustainable answer to that question. If we come up with a directory, if we come up with resources that are shared amongst a group of people, then I don't become responsible for contacting that person. I can say, ultimately, we would want to say, refer to your spiritual father, and your spiritual father will now be equipped with these resources. But if those issues are not coming to the presenters, they're oftentimes going to the clergy, if it even gets to that point, right? I think the question is, it's great now that in our community people are talking about these issues. It's excellent. What we're seeing now is the question, now what? Like, now I've admitted that this is something that I need to work with. Now what do I do? I think we're out of time. Thank you all for the patience with me and my PowerPoint. If you have any questions, please feel free to come up and ask.